Hello, and welcome to Music and Art in the Catholic Tradition, Module 3, Lesson 1. We're in the Renaissance this week, and today we're going to be talking about musical thought in the Renaissance. There's so many things we could talk about in these excerpts for Lesson 1. I really wish that we could talk about all of them. In a sit-down class, we would dedicate at least one whole class period, at least an hour to talking about them, but I've only got around 15 minutes to talk about them today. So I want to focus on one really interesting thing, and I also want to mention a bunch of connections to the past. I just want to make sure that you're recognizing them. And then I'll focus on discussing one particularly interesting element. What is that element that I am deliberately not telling you and increasing the suspense by not saying what it is and leaving you to continue thinking about it by continually not saying it? Well, hopefully I won't reach the point where you'll just get tired and not care about what it is anymore. That idea is newness, the value of newness. We haven't really seen in the medieval era or in the ancient Greeks a particular emphasis on the value of newness. In fact, when we look at Plato, newness is a bad thing. Newness is a bad thing for Plato because if you have music that's already perfect, if you add things to it, that's an excess, right? And as St. Thomas Aquinas would say, an excess detracts from beauty. Too much or too little makes something imperfect, whereas true beauty lies in it being fitting, being exactly as much as it needs to be and no more and no less. That also goes back to Plato as well, right? The graceful simplicity of no more or no less, things being exactly the way they should be, exactly appropriate imitations, as Aristotle would say. Newness is perhaps a bad thing in the past, at least for Plato, in the case of music, and yet we have one very prominent author in these excerpts saying that newness is a good thing and actually criticizing people who are not with the times, so to speak. Now, philosophically, we tend to think that doesn't really come around as an idea until the 19th century with the Hegelians and Schopenhauer and the ideas that there's this sort of teleological, sort of ordered, goal-directed progression through history. And newness is valuable because it represents the age that's been delineated in this goal-directed history, and that value of newness lies in its ability to represent the age and then to move us away from that age into a new age as history progresses teleologically. But let's just go over some of the recurring themes that are coming back again in the Renaissance that we've seen all the way back to ancient Greece. So you'll notice in Tincturus, he emphasizes the power of music on page 14 when he's talking about the ancient Greeks and how they, even if some of the things they say about music is fabricated, it must not be that far off because poets wouldn't just outright lie about the power of music. And he also talks about how highly they valued it and how potent must have been that melody by whose virtue gods, ancestral spirits, unclean demons, animals without reason, and things insensate were said to be moved. So we still have this idea that music is quite powerful, and indeed we see that in Cortesi as well. If you turn over to the Cortesi excerpt, he writes, "It is evident that all the habits and motions of the soul are found in the nature of the modes in which nature, the similarity to fortitude, or temperance, or anger, or mildness is exhibited, and it can easily be observed and judged that the minds of men are usually brought to those motions just as they are excited by the action of the modes. Nor can there be any doubt that things resembling each other are forced to be such, in fact, by the very closeness of their affinity." And he goes on to say that there's certain types of music you shouldn't use because they inspire immorality, certain kinds that you should use. that inspire morality. And of course, this book that he's written, the books on the Cardinalate by Cortese, are guidebooks for cardinals on how to live a good life, how to live a proper life. And so he's telling them, I think you should use music after dinner. I think it's good for instilling good morals. And I think that it's really quite powerful because it can affect your morals. I think you should watch out. All these things that we've heard before from Plato. We also see this emphasis on proportion in Tinctorus that, of course, we've seen in many, if not all, of the authors that we've talked about previously, when he writes, But alas, I have perceived that not only these, but many other famous composers, whom I admire, while they compose with such subtlety and ingenuity, and with incomprehensible sweetness, are either wholly ignorant of musical proportions, or indicate incorrectly the few that they know. I do not doubt that this results from a defect in arithmetic, a science without which no one becomes eminent, even in music. For from the innermost parts all proportion is derived. Therefore, to the purpose that young men who wish to study the liberal and honorable art of music may not fall into similar ignorance and error in proportions and in praise of God, by whom proportions were given, and for the splendor of your most consecrated majesty, etc., etc., I enter with the greatest facility my powers permit upon this work, which with appropriateness to its subject, I conclude, should be called the proportional of music. So here he's talking not only about proportional relationships between notes, i.e. intervals, he's also talking about the way the rhythms are written proportionally, and that is perhaps more obviously mathematical to the average user and listener than the intervals themselves are, although they are equally mathematical if you consider them abstractly. So, proportion is taken as a given by Tinctorus to be an important part of music, otherwise he wouldn't care if people were ignorant of it. And obviously, to make good music really perfect, he's suggesting that it has to be well proportioned in every respect, even if it's sweet, even if it's well invented, even if it's subtle and ingenious, it still has to be well proportioned. So that's another idea that comes to us from the ancients all the way through the medieval era. And it will stick around for quite some time. Order and proportion and balance and grace and so on and so forth. Now let's stay with Tinctorus and talk about this idea of newness and whether or not it relates to the past or if it's something actually itself new. So, Tinctorus writes, At this time, consequently, the possibilities of our music have been so marvelously increased that there appears to be a new art, if I may so call it, whose font and origin is held to be among the English, of whom Dunstable stood forth as chief. And he goes on to name some French composers. And he says, Nor can the English, who are popularly said to shout while the French sing, stand comparison with them. For the French contrive music in the newest manner for the new times, while the English continue to use one and the same style of composition, which shows a wretched poverty of invention. So the most important things that he's pointing out here are the explicit preference he has for the new manner, the newest manner, which ironically comes from the English, and yet he's criticizing them for not using it. And this emphasis on invention. Things that are inventive or innovative are really good to Tinctorus, something that should be lauded. He doesn't go into a lot of detail as to why they should be lauded, but it seems pretty clear from the context here that he thinks they're really awesome. So the question is, we could say that this, as I've mentioned previously, is in clear conflict with Plato, even though he seems to hold Plato very highly when he references his discussions of music. But why is newness good? Well, what we're talking about now with this newness is an emphasis on unity and variety. Music must be proportional. Music must be ordered. It must be unified. But if it's the same every single time, it will be boring. And so we want some variety. And I think this is also in line with the idea of taste that Cortese talks about in his Cardinalate, where he's saying, when he's using words that we would use to describe food, to describe music. It's sour, it's, too filling, it doesn't satiate, or it makes you, it over satiates you. And so there's this unity, if we want to put it that way, of a objective, rational approach to music that wants to analyze it and describe it in proportional mathematical terms and say this is what beauty equals, or and this rational objective side linked now with a subjective taste-based side where we say, okay, this meets all the qualifications proportionally, but we also have to take into consideration that different people like different foods, and certain foods are appropriate at certain times, and all of that actually is very similar to what we've heard before, right? That is Aristotle saying all the modes do certain things, and everybody is affected by them in similar but slightly different ways, and we shouldn't abandon all of them or some of them just because they may cause negative results. We should instead focus on using them appropriately. So we can say that this emphasis on newness and invention and inventiveness and taste, all of that is not entirely new. It's sort of a synthesis of Plato and Aristotle. Plato saying we should focus on proportion, and Aristotle does that too, of course, but Plato emphasizing that we should focus on proportion and we should keep music perfect once we've got it that way, and Aristotle saying things should be fitting imitations and they should be graceful and all that, but some things that are, not morally upright, like lascivious modes that make you angry, modes that make you sad, we can use them in an appropriate context and they will be beneficial. So some people might like sour music, some people might like lots of runs and stuff. It's not good for your morals, but a lot of spicy food isn't good for your stomach either. You should only eat it in moderation. So if we figure out what suits our palate, our musical palate, and we also know what's morally right and what's morally wrong in terms of music, then we can make informed decisions. Tinctoris, though, he's emphasizing newness, and he doesn't give us a lot to go on. So even though what Cortese is talking about in terms of taste, we might say is based on Aristotle and Plato combined, it's not so easy for us to say something like that about Tinctoris. So the answer, perhaps, or another possible way of looking at Tinctoris's thoughts here, is the idea that there's always been this theory and practice divide, right? Plato is saying we shouldn't innovate, and yet people continued to innovate. Pope John the 22nd says we shouldn't use all these new manners that composers are using. We should go back to the old way. But nobody listens to him. And now Tinctoris says that all this newness is good. The way I explain it to myself, and it's not 100%, I would never say that I'm the authority, be-all, end-all of anything, is that the theory says, be very careful, watch out, we know these things are a problem, or we know that music has this power, whereas in practical terms, people just can't help it. They they like new things because they get to learn something new, If you woke up every day and said the same words and went the same places and did the same things and ate the same food, it might be really safe for you. It might be the best thing, If you just lived like a robot, you might have the longest life, you might be the healthiest, you might make the most money, you might be the safest, but it wouldn't be a flourishing life. It wouldn't be the good life, as Aristotle might say, because you're not really learning anything new. You've been told or you've figured out what the best course of action is, and you've had no reason to experience anything new or learn anything new because you've already found what works best. It's the same sort of thing with music. So Plato says this works best for us. Let's just stick with this and not do something new. But that gets boring, and people want to try new things and learn new things and have new experiences. So Tinctorius is valuing newness because everyone values newness. It's just unusual that Tinctorius is talking about it now, and we haven't seen people talk about it before. But I think one of the differences is Tinctorius is really the first practical musician who is writing something that we're reading. Boethius was not a practical musician. He was a philosopher who studied music like philosophers do. And Aquinas, as a priest, he would have sung, but he wasn't a musician, a practical musician in the same sense that Tinctorius was. So we're really just seeing a different perspective now that we haven't seen for the first time, but it doesn't mean that it hasn't been around. It just hasn't been expressed by the pure philosophers. It's only been in the minds of those boots-on-the-ground musicians, not even just people who make music, but professional musicians like Tinctorius. So that's the explanation I would give for it, but I have not read all the literature, and I'm not an expert in early Renaissance philosophy. It just makes sense to me when I think about it that way. But I'm very interested in hearing what you think about it. And that is, having gone, I think, quite over time, all the time we have for Lesson 1. Let me know if you have any questions. I look forward to discussing this topic with you. And until next time, see you later, and have a great day wherever you may be.